this lecture and four more, which we'll put on the internet for you. We'll have a second hour exam, and then you have a choice. We will average the grades on the 2 hour exams. And if you get an A, B, C, D, hard for you to get a D in this course, but you can manage it. And then you have a choice. You can accept that averaged grade for the semester, and then you don't have to take the final. Or you can go ahead and take the final and try to raise your grade, or just to take it. Some people take it just to make sure they've learned on what did you take the course for. You want to get as much out of it as you can. To put it in crude middle class terms, you paid for it, I believe. So that's what the course still has in order for you, but you don't have to take the final. So you might be thinking whether you would want to accept your average grade for the first 2 exams and then set yourself free. We will go with you either way. And I will say all this at least twice more, certainly on the preparation for the second hour exam lecture. So now, our 4th online lecture on gender and genius. What is that about? We've read Immanuel Kant, and I think have some insight into the great German philosopher's historical role in his Critique of Judgment, which was published way late in the 18th century, 1890. And I think the people who've written these 3 essays on feminism and art that we're reading realized that by the end of the 18th century, you were almost into the Romantic era. People didn't know it, but it was a groundswell that was everywhere, and Kant was part of that groundswell. Genius is something inborn, and it can't be taught, but what you have to do is, if you can find it, then try to remove the obstacles to it and to encourage it, and to give the possibility of training, which you must have. And an awful lot of art is not this intuition or insight that grounds the artwork, but it's all the preparation for it and learning how to use, if you're a painter, all these styles of painting and styles of paint and canvases and all this. Or if you're a writer, you have to have read a lot of literature, and you'll have to have learned different styles of writing and different types. And, the essay is different from the novel, which is different from poems, which is different from theater or drama. You've got an awful lot to learn. And so there's a technical and historical background you have to get. But then people have that, and some come along and do something neat. Other people have that, and they don't become what we call geniuses. I'm not sure, but what I'd like to just get rid of the word. I think it gets in the way more than it helps. And feminists certainly think so. So we have then Gender and Genius, which is 300 and 305 pages. What's the fundamental thing in that essay? That is, it is a feminist argument that the very term genius has been terribly destructive of women's chances to become artists if they wish to be. I'm talking to the women in the class. You may not want to be an artist. You may want to be something else. But if you want to be and take a shot at it, then there shouldn't be all of these institutional blocks that keep you from doing it. I have taken this magazine, Science Magazine, for some 50 years now. I don't know if you can see it. Can you read that? Yeah, it comes out every 2 weeks, and it's a sort of the mouthpiece of the American scientific establishment, and you have to know that when you read it. The other magazine that I take is called The New Scientist, and rather than being the magazine of the main view, it's the magazine that gives you all these odd views of people and they're always introduced as the latest thing that's sure to succeed, and they always end up by saying, I need grant money, please help me. But they don't say it in those words. But I'm really fascinated to see this struggle of feminism happening in science, where women have, number one, had a hard time advancing in science because of male prejudice. And then second, they have a hard time being recognized, even if what they have done is outstanding. So in this particular issue, I could read it to you, but it would get beyond the purposes of this course. You've got several women scientists who are finally being recognized, and it's been hard to do. And they certainly recognize it. And so, let's go on then to gender and genius. And there I find something that is genuinely fascinating. You know, when I was your age or younger, I bought this whole myth of the great artist, the romantic genius who defies tradition and takes chances and suffers and is in a state of misery. What aesthetic culture we had in Houston and none in Gainesville. What aesthetic culture we had in Houston was a sort of strangely appropriated romanticism. And it was truly funny if you look at it from our own vantage point. But at the time, people would take it very seriously. And I think I told you the story of Miss Phipps, who was our creative writing teacher when I wanted to be whatever a creative writer is. And she said, you go to the top of a hill on a dark and windy day, and when the thunderstorm comes, it overwhelms you, and you pour out your feelings in scoriac rivers of molten desire. I said, what? What do I do? So you go up on the hill. Well, there aren't any hills in Houston. I don't know if you've ever been there. The nearest thing you could do is get on an overpass over the interstate, but then you'd get run over by a semi, and particularly in a thunderstorm. So I never did get to become a great writer. But what she was so insisted upon, no thinking. You mustn't think. This must come out as pure feeling. And once you have pure feeling, then you have true art. And I had this problem. I kept thinking about things, and it ruined my capacity to be a poet, no matter how hard you tried. That was the kind of, I can't find, redneck romanticism, strange romanticism that we were so, but this was not unusual in the United States. After all, we were a nation until really the 1930s, a nation of small towns. And so you got what culture you could. They had something called the Chautauqua, which would every summer would come, and you would have speakers coming in, and they would get you couthed. They would get you educated, and they would bring you up on the latest thing or what they thought was the latest thing. And it helped out here in the outback, but you would tend to get a kind of bizarre romanticism. Well, how did it hurt women? And I think, I don't know that it had to. You know, that it did. That it did so. Now, where did I put that? Here it is. My notes. The word genius, after all, has had different meanings. It could have meant just your guiding spirit, or your guardian angel, or the spirit of the house. The Russians called it a domovoi, and they keep a lot of these old things. But as originally understood, genius had nothing to do with originality. It had to do with your ability to copy the old masters and get as close to them as you could, something in which the Renaissance was a sort of halfway house. In the one sense, they were copying the Greeks, but soon they wanted to excel them and get beyond them. Well, the more you had to do that, the less you could depend on copying, and the more you had to create something. That lasted until the late 18th century, and then something rather odd happened. In the previous years, what was man? Man, masculine man, was reason and self-restraint and capacity to know the fundamentals which were well known. So when you keep moving into the late 18th century, then you find yourself saying, no, the old models won't do. We have to get new ones. What are they? And so you have the author talking about a man named Edward Young, a late 18th century writer whom I had never heard of before. And he located genius in the unconscious mind, in what you couldn't explain. It had to do with feeling, with instinct, whatever that is, and with imagination. Little did he know in the late 18th century, when everybody was a classicist and didn't want to hear this, was that he would have a descendant in a Miss Phipps in 1953 in Houston, Texas. He had no idea of that. He was an English clergyman of the 18th century, and Houston didn't exist. So, yeah, so the thing gets inverted. And then what is the genius? Not the man of reason, but the man of instinct and feeling and imagination and the ability to create something new. Why did that happen then? These things don't just happen in a bell jar. They don't happen in a vacuum. There was a historical context, and the author talks about the Industrial Revolution, when people left the countryside in droves to work in factories in the city. They had a great nostalgia for the older rural ways. And when you consider the hardships of the cities, that would be easy to understand. But also, besides a couple of things that she doesn't bring into play, but I think should be mentioned. One is all these revolutions, and the American Revolution, and then you have the French Revolution, then you have more revolutions. All of those premised on the assumption that the past is now far past and we have to create a new world. As Shakespeare says in The Tempest, "O brave new world, to have such people in it." That preceded the Industrial Revolution, but it didn't precede the Scientific Revolution, which preceded the Industrial. So you have both industrialization, then you have the political tumult as the old order got thrown off, and then you have the scientific, and then you have the political, and then you have the social and economic. And all of those things add together to make a new climate. Well, new climates don't just happen. The old guard will always resist, for good reasons or bad. The old guard will always resist, as in America, the old guard resisted modernism when it was imported from Europe. But then everything we had that was supposed to be any good had to be imported from Europe. Well, so this was the flip-flop, why was that strange? Because it brought into play assumptions that made the qualities that formerly were derogated to women now the proper qualities that people had to have to be geniuses. And so where in the past women were said not to have reason strong enough to be able to succeed. Now they didn't have feelings. Well, now look, here's the thing. Women put down because all they did is have feelings. When feelings became necessary to the great artist, suddenly women didn't have good feelings. They had only reason. So this thing goes through a flip-flop. And the flip-flop is, I never, of course, I mean, I didn't have any background in Houston and anymore. I didn't know anybody that had any background. Who could I talk to? Basketball coach was a good guy, but he didn't worry about these things. Yeah, I can remember feeling like that Miss Phipps was right and that I had to go to the top of a high and windy hill and suffer and give birth to these. Well, that's making a man into, in certain ways, a woman. And suddenly the man has not only the properties of instinct and feeling and imagination, but also of giving birth. Let's see if I can find her. Yeah, page 308. I like what she says about Nietzsche because it inverts, so to speak, what Nietzsche is and makes you think twice. Let's see, 308. Yeah, she's got one little paragraph on Nietzsche. It could have been a paragraph on Wagner, because both of these people, I think, without realizing it, were celebrating all the virtues that used to be had by women, but now couldn't be had by women because they were the virtues that had to be had by men. So, this tendency to promote the artist as a male mother, is that weird? I never thought about it. Thank you, Miss Phipps. Reached its apogee in the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche. But as Nietzsche also proves, male appropriation of the images of motherhood did not make men any kinder or more understanding towards real-life female creatures. His verbal brutality towards women artists and even towards all educated women coexist with his own identification of himself as psychically female. What a strange criticism to be made of Nietzsche at the point in which he thought he was strongest. That is, Nietzsche's and Wagner's philosophy were overtly and clearly masculine. And Nietzsche is forever, Zarathustra conquers women, and who is Nietzsche's mouthpiece in his long, wordy, and rather florid poem, Thus Spake Zarathustra. This is a masculine essay, as are Wagner's operas almost without exception. And in every point without exception. You have male heroes taken from the Vikings and the old Germanic whatever. And these male heroes are masculine towards women and towards other people and towards nature and towards, except that you have Siegfried in his Rhine journey, who is empathically part of nature and empathically part of feelings that are part of nature. Well, that was what women were supposed to be before Siegfried had his, or the Forest Murmurs, in which you're in the forest. I think it's a wonderful piece of work from the vantage point of an environmentalist, because it puts you into nature and makes you see nature not as something alien, but as something that you're part of. Well, people don't like to admit that because you're part of nature. Things in nature die, and you might have to die, and we don't want to have to face that. Nonetheless, as you'll see in the next lecture that we read, you find that in the masculine ego, nature and woman and Mother Nature and Gaia are female. Well, if you want a war against nature, that's also a war against women. That is, in what sense? You must keep them down at all costs because of the terrible things they could do if they got up on their own 2 feet. What are these terrible things they would do? Nobody's ever really clear about that. They seem to have a castration fear of some kind. And where does this come from? Now, I know I'm being very wordy, and I'm covering a lot of ground and just throwing stuff at you, but that's to give you the impression of what's happened when art and genius generally become a matter of feeling and instinct and imagination. Then this is feminine by the terms in which men had talked about women for generations. So then you have this strange thing of the man becoming feminized but denying it at all moments. And if there ever was a case more obvious than Nietzsche, I don't know what it is. And I can understand Nietzsche was raised in a house of 6 or 7 sisters. He was one brother. He had no one to call on to help him. And these were Victorian German Lutherans. And it must have been a fierce and miserable surroundings for the young Nietzsche, who had to defend himself, he felt, and probably did, against his sisters. But this would certainly lead to a revulsion against women and a reaction against them. That is, if you psychoanalyze Nietzsche, a lot becomes very clear that you wouldn't necessarily get just reading The Birth of Tragedy. Note the birth. This was a birth pain and a birth struggle that these great men went through. But they're men, they're not women. Well, if they're women, if they're men, why are they giving birth? I mean, this is the basic structure that we're talking about in this particular essay, that somehow men took on women's virtues but had to deny it to the death. And it kept on. That is the next essay that we read. We will be talking about the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. That's MoMA. Everybody just says MoMA rather than going through the Museum of Modern Art and having to pronounce something. That's something Americans like to do. Take a long phrase and just shorten it, which is fine with me. But the Museum of Modern Art then becomes then a kind of male-dominated fantasy. And all of this stuff that Tom Wolfe is arguing against and criticizing, he doesn't mention the feminist side of it, and he doesn't mention the nature side of it. Now, the feminist side and the nature side interest me a lot, because the culture we have has tended to be repress women and fight nature. Well, okay, we don't need to repress women, and that's just silly. And second, although, yeah, it brings problems, but gender brings problems no matter what you do. And then second, if we have a Freudian fix against nature, how well are we going to do to save the environment we have to have in order to live, much less become rich? Our culture needs a nice, in my opinion, house cleaning. And I think art could help us to do that. If the artists say we don't want to be involved in anything like that, well, they can do that. But I think one of the things that you get in these 3 essays, I'm trying to remember exactly when they were published. Gender and Genius was published in the late 1970s or early 1980s. And even there, you begin to see that this fixation that people had on purity and on abstractness had it had worn itself out. It couldn't go any further. It just collapsed, which is what would be wrong with the worship of purity. So you have people beginning very soon to say, well, art cannot be hermetically sealed in a chamber by itself. It has to have the influx of everything, woman and culture and people and society and whatever else there is. Yeah. So when you have these changes, they are the function of major changes in society. That's number one. I would ask you to get that in your notes. Second, the big change that happened beginning in the late 18th century was that the artist began taking on female characteristics. They say they're female. Well, female as men had viewed women. Many women would have, how many women do I know whose husbands are great leaders and successes in business, and you know very well that they're twice as intelligent as the husband and managed his career quietly. And in the southern plantation, very likely the southern woman ran the plantation, and the man drank and played cards and galloped around on his horse and was a good old boy. And that's why I say that if the women in our family had fought the Civil War, the South would have won. That's a bit of a caricature, but not too much. So you get this picture of Nietzsche. It's just one little paragraph. I wish he'd done 2 pages on it and quoted some of the things he said about women artists or women intellectuals. But if a man is taking on female virtues and must at all costs deny every one of them, that's somebody in a hell of a tension, and it would not probably lead to kindness. And then there's Kant. From pages 309 to 311, she talks about Kant, and really, when you think of Kant, you mostly think of the Critique of Pure Reason, which I have read and suffered with endlessly when I was young. And it is a description of the knowledge, the a priori knowledge that is necessary in order to do science. We have a set of forms of perception, a set of categories of understanding, that's 12, 2 forms of perception, space and time. We have the ideas or ideals of reason, which are God, freedom, and immortality. So you got 3, 12, and 2, and they're exactly those. And Kant brilliantly shows how all these are necessary to think Newtonian physics, which is still the physics, I suppose, most used in practical ways. Not always, but it's very common. If you look at the interstate, how do you build a bridge? You don't use quantum physics. You use Newton's physics. How do you build a building? How do you build a dam? Well, you don't use relativity. You use Newton. So we're still into Newton's way of thinking. And so for Kant, the point I'm making is that what most people think of Kant is the Kant of the Critique of Pure Reason, where reason is shown only to be useful when it is applied to the world or phenomena, and thus can construct scientific knowledge. What is the world really like? We don't know, but we know what we construct and we know how we must construct it. So that's the Kant most people get. In this course, you discover another Kant, and I've heard German professors and the Germans always teach Kant, the way the French teach Descartes. The Germans say you should read from the 3rd critique, the one you've read a portion from, the Critique of Judgment, back through the Critique of Practical Reason, then to the Critique of Pure Reason, and then you understand Kant, who basically was more of an ethical and an aesthetic person than an epistemological and scientific person. And I think it's true. So I was amazed to discover the Critique of Judgment, in which Kant introduces the notion of genius almost in the romantic form. That is, the genius has a gift, and the gift is of feeling, of imagination, of originality, but it's constrained by reason, which gives the law to all of our thinking and all of our producing. But Kant really, like another guy that if we had time we would have discussed, David Hume, predecessor of Kant in English empiricism, and Hume was the same way. A lot of his writing and his emphasis on feeling led to Romanticism. Neither of them wanted it, both of them helped create it. Makes me glad I'm not a famous philosopher. Who knows how much evil I could have done. But in any case, so earlier, and this is on page 309, earlier I wrote about the way that Romantic aesthetics built on the metaphysics and epistemology of the late 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant's own treatise on aesthetics, The Critique of Judgment, contains one of the most influential and celebrated definitions of genius. Quotes from Kant: "Genius is the talent or natural gift which gives the rule to art. Since talent, as the innate productive faculty of the artist, belongs itself to nature, but not to reason, nature is still inferior to reason. We may express the matter thus: genius is the innate mental disposition through which nature gives the rule to art." Very brilliant, very brilliant. One of the things that a philosopher can do, because they spend so much time studying and crafting and being careful about ideas, is to come up with something that much clearer than fumbling around simply with feelings. Miss Phipps fumbled with feelings, but I didn't get any insight from it. I got wet on thunderstorms and bad poetry. But Kant could be clear and show how this all fitted in. But he ended up when he makes the distinction between the beautiful and the sublime, which might have been relegated to women, now becomes masculine, and the beautiful is what's relegated to women. So here, you could see why feminists would get very angry with this, and then appropriate the woman aspects of the woman, and then declare that the woman is inferior in these things. I don't know. It's really a shell game. But when it happened, very few really noticed it. Okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to read to you. Prepare yourself. Kant allows that women, and this is on page 311, okay, 311. For Kant, a woman genius is not impossible, but for a woman to aim at the sublime makes her merely ridiculous, and even worse. The word he uses, let me get my glasses on here, and then I will at least read correctly. If a woman tries to be a genius and get into the sublime, she is a freak who is disobeying nature and aping the genius of the male, who is her and nature's lord and master. Got that? Any small town in Texas, that will be the rule. Feminists should never go to Bowie. Okay? Women have a passion to dominate, but this passion naturally expresses itself through charm. Nature gives women a taste for the beautiful, but not the sublime, so that they can beautify themselves more efficiently and hence help nature fulfill its goal of reproducing the species. A man has his own goals and purposes, but a woman has only nature's purposes, which are inferior. They're good, but they're down there in the hierarchy. Okay? Kant's female sex is an aesthetically pleasing sex, which I will have to be honest and say that I don't mind. If I'm going to tell you that I don't feel that way anymore, I would be lying to you like a professor. So let's see, let me get it straight. Kant's female sex is an aesthetically pleasing sex, but not a fully human sex, nor a sex capable of wielding the kind of quasi-divine power that makes a male a junior god the father. Because one of the other things that happened in the period we're talking about, the late 18th and into the 19th century, as religion began to decline, people tried to make art play the role of religion. And so the painter became sort of the prophet, one of God's prophets and a sort of demigod or semigod. Okay? Only males are capable of true justice and sublime genius, like our president. Males are the natural rulers, females are their natural subjects. Well then, how do you explain Joan of Arc? She was a very good general. Or how do you explain Boadicea, who was the Celtic chieftainess who fought the Romans with and put together an army? Is this impossible? And were these less than feminine or less than human? No. Kant doesn't mean to put women down. He just does. I think this is true of a lot of men. They don't mean, I mean, it's part of the reason why women and men don't understand each other as well as they should. Women need to understand who they potentially can be, and then men need to understand what women have in common with any human being. There, you've had your sermon for the sermonette for the day. What is so disturbing about Kant's notion of genius is that he dissents from the pre-romantic emphasis on passion whilst maintaining their emphasis on the maleness of genius. Rousseau was one of Kant's great heroes, and as we've seen, Rousseau declaring that women lack genius because they lack sufficient passion. So they flipped the thing, but then denied that women had what they used to insist defined a woman. I know I'm repeating myself, but I think I'm educating you to see something that it's very easy to overlook. And how do I know that? I overlooked it. Okay? For Rousseau, passion is valued, and that it is passion that women are seen to lack. This is a typical thesis of late 18th century theories of genius. Whatever faculty is most highly prized is the one that women are seen to lack. In the case of, well, William Duff, who is he? Genius is primarily a matter of imagination, but female imagination is, of course, inferior to that of a male. I think of Georgia O'Keeffe, whom you probably know. Her imagination wasn't lacking at all. Compare her to the men around her, and she was superlative. But at any rate, I had never envisaged Nietzsche as somehow trying to raise femininity to masculine heights, and that I had never realized that Kant had taken the position on women and man that he did. I've been busy teaching the first and the second critique, and hadn't read, and in the third critique it's not there. You have to read some of his other smaller pieces, in which he gives you the Prussian idea of what a woman is. Does he mean to? I don't think so. It's just so deeply ingrained. Okay. So then, on page 312, now what time did we start this? Do you know? I didn't check. Well, I'll just
We're at 40 minutes right now.
About 40 minutes? Well, what I'll do is go through these, and then you will get these in your notes. 5 different definitions of genius, and only the 5th, which in a way, I think rather does away with the concept of genius. I believe in native talents. I think they're genetic. That my grandfather, who was illiterate and had wandered around trying to raise money for his family to live on from the time he was 9 or 10 years old, it wasn't his environment. It gave him the capacity to see a blueprint as a building the first time he saw it. It was just born into them. And nothing on his wife, my grandmother's life out on a farm in the Tennessee mountains, led her to be a dress designer. There was just nothing. She just had that knack. So genius depends upon genetic factors. And so I don't think we can quite get rid of it. Indeed, I think, but then I don't see why we must assume that women don't have it. They may see things somewhat differently than men. They may perceive the world differently than men. But that doesn't mean that the greatest art can't come out of that vision. And they can also see what men see. As usual, I'm not satisfied to see what the problems are. I want to solve them. And how can art do this? Well, by getting rid of modernism, for one thing. Okay, here we go. Number one, and this is on page 312. There are 5 separate strands in our modern usage of the term genius. Only one, and she gets that in italics, only one of these. Got that? Which can be utilized for feminist ends. How about human ends? I mean, making women free to be who they can be is not just for women, it's for the human race. Isn't it? No, it's not. It's just for women. Well, that becomes something interesting and a point where the women's movement has divided. Do you want to be imitation men and succeed in business? Or do you want to be female, women, uniquely female, and then have a chance to go into business if you want to? You may decide you much rather raise kids. Is that inferior? No. No, it can require a lot of genius. Okay, so there are 5 strands. The first idea of genius that must be rejected, she's coaching you pretty well, comes from the Romantic and represents genius in terms of a personality type. What type is that? Well, an outsider, near to madness, degenerate, shamanistic. I don't know that all the Romantics took on that, all of those, I don't know what. The second related, so you got the first idea, which is this flamboyant, weird genius. And the second, which is related, of genius, comes to us from the pre-Romantics, who explained it as a specific mode of consciousness, variously described as passion, imagination, instinct, intuition, the unconscious. Reason. No, let's see. Okay, and reason is thrown in there because it was a potpourri, it was just a chaos, it was a stew of different notions all bubbling together. Feeling or imagination, they're usually viewed as not being the same thing. A third strand, again related, and again slightly different, describes genius in terms of energy, usually sublimated sexual energy. These first 3 senses of genius are utterly contaminated by past usage and by the way that the male still provides the paradigm for both the normal and supernormal personality types, consciousness types, and energy types. So here they are, a personality type, a consciousness type, and an energy type. And those are the first 3 kinds of genius, and don't you use them. They're useless for building a feminist aesthetics. The fourth notion of genius is the one that was predominant in the early 18th century and which survives in modern scientific and pseudoscientific theories that seek to quantify talent and creativity through tests and statistical surveys. Genius is treated as a kind of potential for eminence a potential which is then glossed in terms of skill or talent. Here also, the standards of achievement of talent have been devised with males in mind. This fourth sense of genius is also fundamentally flawed by a naivete about the relationship between facts and values. There's a neat book that I want to recommend to you. I remember this an old man goes back to his youth and finds all these really funny things that happen. We took an IQ test in the Houston School District. I think people still do something like that. And then it was all kept secret. We didn't know our IQ. So then something happened, and it was felt that people should be told, and so we were told our IQs. And this meant that 5 or 6, 8 or 10 guys, because the women never did this, who was more intelligent, strutted through the halls of Lamar High School as geniuses in residence. They were the great geniuses. Well, not one of those guys, I've never heard of a single one of them doing anything besides getting a job and making money, and I don't know what, maybe they succeeded in the bowling league. I don't know what they succeeded in. They sure weren't productive geniuses. And the book is Stephen Jay Gould's. He wrote a lot of good stuff, but the book that he read that I'm suggesting to you is called The Mismeasure of Man, in which he says, how do you define intelligence by one number, the IQ? Well, because I don't know what my grandfather's IQ was. It was normal, but he had this gift, and in that gift, he was highly intelligent. And I don't know about old grandma, who spent most of her life cooking for grandpa's work crews. How bright was she? Well, she was bright enough, brighter than grandpa. But this capacity to make dresses and to design, and mostly, in her case at least, mostly genetic. So how do you treat intelligence? Is it one thing? Or are there many kinds of intelligence? Now, I don't think anybody has solved the problem, but Gould was good enough to raise it. People who do IQ tests hate him, just like people who are in the art scene as it is supposed to be hate Tom Wolfe. And I've been told, oh, you can't teach Wolfe by artists, and so I teach him. Is intelligence one thing? And just because you don't have a genius IQ, it doesn't mean you don't have a genius. But who knows what it is? Finding it is really the task that young people face, and it's terribly difficult. And I think if anything, we should do everything under the sun to help them look at all the broad possibilities for what they could do for a life. I mean, in Houston, you could do one thing. You could be a businessman. Well, you might be a preacher, or what else? You could be an athlete, especially an athlete. But these other ways were not part of the culture, and so they weren't. That you didn't know that you could be a philosopher because nobody knew what the hell a philosopher was. I remember trying to find somebody in high school that could talk to me about relativity physics, and even the physics professor refused to discuss it. Well, anyhow, but that's what you face out here in Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana and Arkansas, if you particularly go to the small towns, but not just there. So this is not a battle that's over. And finally, we come to not a potential for imminence, but the fifth sense of genius, which the author, Christine Battersby, thinks is the only one that's satisfactory. And what is it? It is thus only the fifth sense of genius that feminists can appropriate for the purposes of transforming cultural history. This fifth sense of genius is a much more pragmatic notion. A person's cultural achievement is evaluated and assessed against an appropriate background of artistic genres and traditions. The genius then is the person whose work, A, here's the fifth definition, and it's got two parts. A, marks the boundary between the old ways and the new within the tradition. So genius involves coming up with something different, seeing things differently, doing things differently, expressing things differently, and this goes beyond what's been given so far. And then second, this has lasting value and significance. How do you measure that? Well, partly by its influence, but I think by its long-lasting cultural significance. There are a lot of composers, there are a lot of novelists and poets who are very famous in their own time, and you never hear from them again. Why? Well, they were eminent, but they didn't pass into the cultural mainstream and go down through history. There was a novelist by the name of Gordon Gunter. I went looking back in my family to see, well, surely we have some culture, and Gordon was it. And his novels were quite famous for about 2 decades. Luckily, they disappeared forever. Nobody reads them. Nobody is going to. So there are people who come up with something that is new but shallow, or new but doesn't speak to anybody in the long run. So for the fifth theory of genius, a person's cultural achievement evaluated and assessed its appropriate background. And so there is a notion of genius which feminists can appropriate. A female genius is a woman who is judged to occupy a strategic position in the matrilineal and patrilineal patterns of tradition that can make up culture. Her world must be seen to have a worth and importance that extends beyond mere popularity or influence on other artists. And so far as we use the word genius for feminist ends, we have to be clear that we are not describing a personality type or some kind of weird psychic energy. Indeed, we're not describing it all. And since women have been excluded from the academies and have found it difficult to have their art products taken seriously, we should expect even today that there will remain fewer female than male geniuses. And so, that's the end of from gender and genius. In the next one, by Professor Duncan, she has a capacity to look at the same thing Tom Wolfe does, the Museum of Modern Art. And what you see there is already in the essay that you've just read. That's why I chose it. And goes, I think, beyond it in wonderful ways and embarrassing to men, but I would think even more embarrassing to 20th century modernist art, because something came along with modernism that I've always remarked at. Something comes along with modernism which is almost a demonization of the woman. You see this a lot in Picasso, for example. But you also see it in a number of the American artists. And it's weird. Why do that? Why have this markedly negative attitude towards woman among artists who you'd think, if they embrace reality, would be able to embrace the feminine? Goethe, who makes, I think, an interesting contrast with the guys that we've been talking about. He was a late 18th, early 19th German poet and writer. And Goethe says, the eternal feminine doth lure us on. That is, we need the feminine to achieve. And he said so. My goodness, a German said so. This is But what we get into then in the next period is talking about the way in which American modernism, which was abstract art, basically, American modernism uh, had an extraordinary devaluing of woman and a strange, really sick. I mean, if that's the way you feel about women, go find a shrink, but be sure it's not a Freudian shrink, because Freud, as feminists have said, has all these masculine assumptions about libido and a sublimated male sexuality. And what he said a couple of times in his career that gets quoted, woman, what does she want? Well, if the great founder of psychoanalysis can't understand women, if a woman needs to go, as people do sometimes, to get some psychological help, is she going to go to a Freudian? I hope not. Go to a Jungian, go to someone else. But I'm perhaps making some women in this course aware of some things that you might not have noticed. And the men in the course, some of whom will think I'm ranting and losing my mind, these are some things you need to recognize. Not just know, as you know a statistic, but realize it. It's real, and it affects you. Okay, so then we're going to talk about two things in the next lecture. What we essentially talked about in this lecture was the way in which feminine qualities became invested in the concept of genius, and that happened underground in the late 18th century and broke out with the Romanticism beginning around 1900. And then you have a feminized artist busy having to deny that feminism. It's almost like somebody having to deny, they're in denial because they're gay and they can't admit it. And I've had friends who went through that and suffered a lot for it until somewhere in their middle age, they realized it. Well, maybe the culture needs to realize this strange, unhappy ambiguity and unhappy neurotic tension we have with male and female in the society. Wouldn't we all be healthier? Might we all be happier? Well, I'd like to think so. So the second thing is, why did all these male artists work their way towards absolute purity and independence from nature and woman? Now, nature and woman, okay? There's something that I've been wanting to tell you about, and I'll mention, have any of you heard of the Gaia hypothesis? It's the hypothesis that the planet Earth is really an organism which keeps giving birth. Gaia was a woman goddess of the Greeks, which keeps giving birth and also has the capacity, not unlimited, but the capacity to defend itself. A lot of scientists don't like reference to goddesses and to myths. They like the myth of science, but they don't want you to talk about myths. So what the next essay does then is not only talk about this weird accompaniment of abstract modernism, which is a bizarre, evil, frightening woman. Boy, I've had some strange blind dates. I know nothing resembling that. No matter how it didn't work out, it might have been my fault. I never met a woman who looked like that or acted like that. What's wrong with these guys? And you find out that from 1945 on, it becomes very clear, and particularly in America, that you want to revolt against nature, you want to revolt against woman, you want to revolt against the world and all of its tawdriness and all of its death and struggle and that, and you want to go up into something that is pure, a pure realm of spirit. Why? I I'm not sure I understand that at all, but that's what we'll talk about then in the next lecture before we go on to talk about the aesthetic attitude. And it is very strange for me. I've never given a lecture in my study before. So I'm having a bit of a struggle, but I hope it's helpful to you. And even though I'm throwing so much stuff at you, there's a few basic things that you can get. And so we'll continue these and give the third feminist lecture in the next one.